Hello and welcome to another session, number 11, for College Success Skills. I am always Mr. Fowler here in my inimitable style, delivering some fresh content for you for today. So let's go ahead and start talking about what is on our agenda. First and foremost, we're going to begin, as we do each session, with a little bit of a preview and review. So today, we're going to go ahead and revisit the revision questions that were posed for this week's discussion forum, week number 5 discussion forum. Then we're going to move into a bit of a double header for our lecture today. First of all, we're going to talk about how to get the most out of a lecture, and we'll review Chapter 10's ideas on the best possible way to take notes. I think those two topics are kind of like peanut butter and jelly, or maybe peanut butter and chocolate, depending on your perspective. In any event, they partner together relatively well, okay? So once I've completed the lecture notes with you, I've got a couple of questions that I want to address before we wrap things up for this session. But we've only got 40 minutes and time is fleeting. So let's go ahead. I'm going to bring up some of these questions that we talked about earlier this week. So let me go ahead and go to share screen for a moment. Sometimes when I click on share screen, it doesn't always come up right away. Yeah, that's fine. All right, so in review, we've completed our self-assessment essay exams. And by and large, we did relatively well with this project. I didn't see too many critical errors. There were a few grammar things here and there that you probably should have been exposed to in English 103. However, I know that I've got quite a few students this semester who were disrupted, let's say, due to the outbreak which occurred last March. As such, there may be holes or gaps in your learning, specifically as they relate to mechanics and grammar concerns. So I tried to minimize my attention to that, to be honest, and focus on the things that I thought were the most important. So then this week, you have 3 various options, 3 ways that you can create very different kinds of responses to your peer review. Now, number 1, I uploaded this document right here, which asks you to consider what the author's key strengths were according to his or her essay. And I would like you to use your own way of writing to explain one important strength that they believe they possessed. What, if any, concerns did the author identify in the essay? Again, this might be slightly tricky because some people were relatively confident in their abilities in transitioning from high school to college. So if they did identify a particular concern, write it down. If not, you can simply say something along the lines of, this student feels relatively capable and I believe that they probably are, or something along those lines. Is there an effective hook that brings you in as a reader? This is totally an opinion question, so you can't really create a wrong answer here. But if there was something compelling, it might be nice to explain that that was an effective bit of work on the student's behalf. Does the essay's format adhere to the assignment description? Are there multiple body paragraphs? Are transitions used effectively? If so, that might be another nice compliment to pay toward a fellow student. Is there a clear thesis statement? Most of the time, based on what I heard, there was a clear or precise thesis statement listed in these self-assessment essays. So I think most of the time your answer should be yes for this one. And lastly, we have an easy one. Does the author need to use effective in-text or parenthetical citations and or an appropriate works cited page? Well, that was not a requirement for this particular assignment. So you can simply write an easy give me answer of this was not a requirement for this particular essay, and you'd be perfectly correct. Now, in terms of how to respond, like I said, you had 3 different ways to do that. Number 1, you could post the file of your paper onto the student discussion board. And once a fellow student had a chance to answer and respond to your papers, you could answer your questions effectively. Number 2, you could use, that was number 1. Number 2, you could use the class list link and reach out to a student, maybe a friend that you've made, or someone you're comfortable with discussing, someone with whom you are comfortable discussing the ideas that we've come across so far in our discussion forums. We have been, working on this for about 5 weeks now, so I hope maybe you made a connection to somebody. If not, maybe this is a great time to expand upon that and invest yourself in some active learning. You may also have a fellow student in another class that you feel comfortable reaching out to because, if nothing else, perhaps you can commiserate over the fact that you have to take college success skills and English 104 with Mr. Fowler this semester. I hope you're not commiserating, to be honest. I hope it's a good experience so far. The third option, number 3, you could use my commentary. Some students have anxiety issues and just aren't comfortable sharing private details with other people. You can use my response to fire back and just evaluate how you felt about the peer review process from my perspective. Not technically a peer for you as a student, I'm your professor, but it is an option for those of you who just feel like you're a little too anxious to make that next step for peer revision. If you've been in my 103 class, though, this should be an old hat by now. Still, I know there are some students for whom that is an issue. So take it with a grain of salt, and understand that every person's mileage may vary on that particular topic. This brings up one other point that I should have addressed earlier. When you submit a document to a fellow classmate, or if you just want to post it on the weekly discussion forum, you should probably post your original version, not the one that I commented on and provided feedback for. That way you don't have to worry about any private material getting out there. If you don't care about that and you're happy and you want to show off your grade, well, that's fine too. But that decision is yours. So I just wanted to put a reminder out there for today's session. Okay, that's pretty much it for the preview and review portion of today's class. Now I'm going to move into fairly straight lecture mode. Just a quick word about that. I have been told by some of my fellow colleagues that it's best when we're doing these Zoom meetings and recordings that I toggle my video off unless it's absolutely necessary, because that might make for a smoother transition in the processing of the video, and it might make the sound especially a little bit easier for all of you. So hopefully that's not going to disturb you if you don't see my face in the upper left hand, in the upper left hand corner up here. It'll just be my voice for the next part. Okay, let's go ahead and begin. I'm going to stop the video, and you should just hear me at this point on audio, And I'm going to share the screen with you and share this PowerPoint. I'm going to go ahead and do a slideshow. So this material will be reflected on your weekly quiz, quiz number 3. And the first part is all about strategic reading. That will be chapter 9. The second section will be from chapter 10, note-taking. So let's start with some guide questions for chapter 9. How can you create a positive learning environment? Why do you need to gear up during reading? And what are some strategies for gearing up? What are the differences between active and passive reading? This will harken back to chapter 2, if you remember that section. And then what are some strategies for concentrating on the textbook reading? All right, and you can see in this picture that all of the things that affect you every day develop or play a role in your positive learning environment. But what does that mean? Well, essentially, creating a good learning environment allows you to enhance your study skills. So when you create a good learning environment, you need to factor in things like noise. That's pretty basic, but you would be surprised at how important that is. What level of sound is optimal for you will vary widely across our class and from person to person. Some people like to study with music on in the background. Some people like absolute quiet. Some people like to have the television or the internet available. But that, like I said, will depend on what's best for you. If you can't control the noise where you study, you may want to shift your study space to one that is more germane to that effort. Now, once you found the appropriate place and level of quiet, or alternatively level of noise, you need to survey your textbooks. That means you should preview the reading assignments that you've been handed out by each professor, and then determine your purpose in reading that particular section or chapter. The text begins this whole chapter by asking a question. Do you find that much of the time you spend reading is unproductive because you're not concentrating and therefore you can't remember what you've read? Do you have a difficult time getting started and staying motivated? Do you get lost if the reading assignment is too long? If so, you may not be geared up for reading. But as the text points out, there are lots of things that you can do to change those factors. Okay, like it said, everyone's a little bit different. Some people prefer complete silence. Other people find that noise can drive their focus. This, again, will vary strongly from one person to the other. However, I found this bit odd. I think the internet could be easily replaced here with television, but the authors of our text do slow down to make a point about television. They said that it can be comforting, but is very distracting. And I agree with that. So I suggest avoiding that temptation in creating the proper study space for you. In addition, I have a couple of other unique tips that if you've never thought about these things or tried them before, may be helpful to you. If possible, try to establish a space in your home or someplace else with all of your learning tools close to hand. So you want to have a place for your laptop, for your notes. If you need special equipment, better lights, things like that. Those should all be in a standard place that you can rely upon and that should not be disturbed. even if you have to find a place with a desk and chair in your basement that you can make your own for the next couple of years, that's going to be a big benefit to you. Also, when you are working, try to select a straight back chair so that you don't slump, and that you can rely on the rigidity. Try that again, Mr. Fowler. You can rely on the rigidity of the chair to kind of keep you awake and alert. You shouldn't have a seat, in other words, it's so comfortable it invites dozing off. And of course, along those same lines, if you study in bed, don't do that. It's too inviting to fall asleep, especially if you're dealing with a boring or difficult subject. When you survey your text, you want to highlight a couple of specific points in your first pass. You should probably read the introduction first, and then any preview questions that appear at the beginning of the chapter. From there, I advise that you don't just start reading. Instead, flip into the chapter or through the book and look for interesting diagrams, pictures, or figures that might appear. Then go to the end of the chapter or section that you've been assigned and read any summary questions or read any review questions that might be present at the end. Now, as you go through the text, I want to note a couple of features about most textbooks. They will have new definitions and important terms listed in either bold or italic text. So pay attention to those as you're actively reading. And then I know this is kind of a strange habit to get it to break from, but remember that as a college student, you own your textbook. So the wide margins that are there, that's not just a formatting choice. Those components are designed specifically to encourage you to take notes. So you've already paid for them, use that space, fill it up, ask important questions. Maybe annotating your text might be a good way to help you actively read and study if you've never tried it before. When you get ready to preview the reading for a particular portion, familiarize yourself with the new information by asking yourself, what do you already know? This can help you because when you come across new or questionable material, you can bounce those concepts against the knowledge that you may have already learned. Beyond that, it's kind of a cop-out from a teacher's perspective, but I think you might just be more interested in what you're reading if you preview it ahead of time. It may help you to make a personal connection with the content in question. Previewing asks you to move through and highlight a couple of specific components as you're looking at the approach to reading a particular portion or chapter or a section. Look at the title of the chapter or section. Review the headings and subheadings that run throughout the chapter. Look at and read the introduction. Then go to the end and read the summary and review any kind of chapter concluding material like study questions, vocab lists, or exercises that might be offered, especially if you're not assigned any of them. The important thing that you want to think about when you're actively reading is that you want to understand your key ideas and ask critical questions about what your text is offering. That's your purpose in reading in the first place. So to enhance your active reading, I've already previewed this, but you should annotate your text rather than highlight it right away. Now, what's the difference between annotating and highlighting? First of all, highlighting is passive, and most students just end up highlighting significant portions of the text without really assigning any meaning to it. And that's counterproductive. Think about it. If you highlighted most of the important material in the text and you didn't read it yet, well, you just made more material for yourself to study. Instead, you should annotate your textbooks. Now, what does that look like? Well, you should summarize important material briefly. That encourages your active learning tendencies, because to summarize, you have to read first. So try to focus on your key ideas and organizing your information. Select what you want to remember and try to reduce the amount of overall material that you absorb within a given chapter. One of the best ways to actively learn is to summarize or use your own words to restate the new information that you come across. Specific information that you should annotate might include definitions, examples, any kind of test questions that you think you can predict by reading the chapter. If you're talking about a history class or a humanities course, people, dates, places, and events are very important. Less so in science and mathematics courses, obviously. Numbered lists and characteristics also tend to be good place, especially in science-based texts, for information to be annotated or important information to be encoded within them. Also, especially with literature and sciences, look for relationships either between characters and environments or institutions for literature, or look for relationships between compounds, chemicals, and reactions in science-based courses. And of course, visuals of any kind are worthy of your time and annotation. When you're studying your annotations, or you're moving into phase 2, read your annotations over to get a feel for the bigger ideas. Try to talk about those concepts out loud in a very precise way so that you can record the information in your skeletal-muscular memory, actually using your jaw, lips, and tongue to repeat the information can actually create a more cemented form of memory in your mind. And when you talk about ideas out loud or with fellow students, which is even better, you make a more personal connection to the material. And of course, when you are studying your annotations, pace yourself. Do a little bit every day so that you don't feel overwhelmed. When you're thinking about the concerns that you might have for annotations, one of the key questions that comes up is, what is really important to annotate? How can I tell what to focus on? Well, the authors have a real good answer. Try to start by focusing on the headings and subheadings. Those are, again, usually reflective of key ideas and concepts that are presented within a course or a chapter or a specific section of your text. Isn't all of this time consuming? It's another important question. And I'm not going to lie, it is, especially at first. But I think over time, you'll find that if you need to use, emphasis on need, to use annotative work to focus on your reading, that it will become more familiar and the process will speed up as you get more comfortable. Now, here's a brief aside. I'll be honest, I didn't annotate my texts when I was in college, but I knew what I was going to study and I was interested in that material. So that was not necessary for me. I also have a pretty good memory, but even for someone who doesn't need to annotate all the time and who is engaged with most of their particular courses, I do have to admit that I had to take notes in history classes because there was just so much information. And I also took frequent notes in science and math-based classes since that was an academic weakness or challenge for me. I didn't have to take very many math classes because I was busy with mathematics in high school. So I completed most of that material. But I did have to take one science-based course, and that required a lot of note-taking as well. And of course, lastly, how can you be certain that the information you annotate is valuable? Well, you really can't. You don't have to have a perfect prediction of what's going to be included in a test, quiz, or exam. If you listen to the instructor and try to focus on what he or she emphasizes, most of the time, you're probably going to be fairly close to the material that you need to annotate and study with. Okay, let's move on to Chapter 10. Effective note-taking. Now, effective note-taking is another really important step in getting the most out of the active reading process. If you take effective notes, after all, you're going to be able to understand the material more comprehensively and refer back to questions or concerns that may arise on the fly. So, questions worth consideration for Chapter 10. Why is it important to take good notes? What should I do before, during, and after class? And how can I use my notes once I've taken them? Well, let's start by defining some of the characteristics of good notes. Good notes tend to be organized, and we're going to end today's lecture by talking about several different forms of organizing your notes. Good notes reflect main points as opposed to minute details. They tend to include examples, and they consider the lecture pattern of the professor in whose class the notes are taken. For example, you might have a more inductive instructor for some classes versus a deductive instructor who lectures according to a specific and structured method of addressing concerns. Mr. Fowler tends to be more of the deductive type of lecturer. I want to explain points in a logical way according to the text, and I try to have a plan at the start of every class. But inductive instructors are also very effective because they can talk about concepts and then summarize the key ideas. Self-testing sections usually are a function of good notes. Again, honesty must come before simple adherence to the text. I didn't really create a lot of self-testing notes when I was in college, so your mileage might vary on that particular aspect of note-taking. But if it's something you already do, keep doing it. And if you struggle to make your reading experience enjoyable or useful, maybe incorporating self-testing questions into your notes might work for you. Good notes also are time-tested, which means if you take effective notes, you can go back months, weeks, or years later in some instances and still understand the basic premise of what it was you were learning and get some valuable material out of that process as well. Good notes also make use of abbreviations in order to keep the ideas flowing and to basically help save you from hand cramps and keep the material flowing and clear as you move from one concrete idea to the other. You can actually move a little bit more quickly when you take notes. Now, there's a really good guide to abbreviations in your textbook on page 118. Just some basic symbols and abbreviations you can use to shorten or create shorthand versions of your complex ideas. So why take notes? Well, a large percentage of what you learn is conveyed through lecture. So taking good notes is an essential skill that you should develop at some point. And here in the first or second semester or the second year of your college training is as good a time as any. Taking good notes does require you to be a little bit aware of the situation in which you find yourself, though. So at this point, we're all online. So taking good notes shouldn't be that difficult, or at least it should be somewhat easier. But because I can't predict what the future of education will be like, how long COVID-19 will last, I do think it's important to consider some of the traditional factors associated with taking good notes. Specifically, you want to consider the class size of the notes, in which you're taking notes. Crowded classes make concentration very difficult as is. So your authors suggest sitting near the front, or if that's not possible, somewhere in the middle of the lecture space, at least within the eye line of the instructor, so that you can stay engaged with what's going on. Secondly, professors can be boring. I've had an unfortunate experience of a student telling me to my face that my class was very boring. As you might predict, she did not do well in that class, right? And we've already discussed this point. You can't just sit on your laurels or complain if your instructor is boring or the information you are, taking in a given class isn't interesting. You're still responsible for the class. Now, I guess you could drop the course and take it again later or change from one section to another, but most of the time this isn't a reality, or it could pose its own set of difficulties. So if you have a boring professor, see if they have web notes or PowerPoints available that you can use, and then compare those notes to the notes that you take in class. Textbook authors actually recommend getting a 3-ring binder for this and putting the professor's notes on one page, and then creating an empty page facing them, or an empty blank page that you can write on. I don't know if that's necessary, but it's an idea for you to kick around. And then, of course, you should also take into consideration your timing. If you're going to take notes in a class that meets after lunch, eat light so that you don't get drowsy and you can concentrate. Maybe just a snack, and then move your lunch later off in the day if possible. If you've got an evening class, by contrast, try to eat something before you go so you've got enough energy to get you through the night. And of course, for those morning classes, well, the authors of our text straight up say, try not to take early morning classes if you can avoid it. Fair enough, but I was always kind of a morning person, so this didn't really impact me. Again, your individual mileage will vary for that issue. But no matter when you take your classes, try to budget time to get plenty of sleep so that you can be alert when you need to, or in case new or important material comes your way during a lecture. Lastly, the authors of our text make a good point when they bring up the issue of health. If or when emotional or physical issues begin to actually impair your ability to concentrate, you might want to seek some kind of professional help, or even reach out to health services. And if that occurs, try to do it sooner versus later within the course of a semester. Okay, general tips. Again, a little bit of revisiting here, or reiterating these central points. Try to sit in the front or the center, and adjust your notes for the professor, right? As I said, I'm a bit more on the deductive side. Here's our plan for the day. Now let's move from very general information to much more specific details. Inductive instructors work in the opposite way. They start by focusing on the specifics, and then they expand and try to create meaning throughout the course of a given lecture. Also, when you're taking notes, remember the key steps. Listen first and think about what's being said. Take your notes after you have processed that information. And I suggest, as do the authors of our text, using the as many paraphrases as you can. So rewrite the professor's points in your own words. Don't just copy down material that they eschew until your hand cramps. That's not really going to get you anywhere. First of all, you'll overwhelm yourself with the amount of information that you create, and then you'll also just have their thoughts on the material. You don't actively learn if you just absorb material. If you're like Mr. Fowler and you're lucky enough to have a really good memory, you can just be a sponge and regurgitate what the professor says. Most students don't really like to do that, and a lot of people just plain can't do that. So these are good general tips to be aware of. Of course, it goes without saying that you should also be prepared, meaning that you have a pencil or pen or writing implement ready to go with paper to write on, or a recording device, or I don't know, a laptop to take notes on. If you have notes that are pre-formatted according to some of the suggestions we're going to see in a few moments, that would be a good use of your time before you enter class. This also is part and parcel of why the author suggests that you show up early if possible. Showing up early enables you to prep all that and get your materials ready to go, whereas being just a few moments late might not be a sin, so to speak, academically. But if you're not prepared and then you have to spend extra time getting ready, you might lose out on some of the more valuable information that's expressed in the beginning of a particular session or lecture. Of course, all of that will be, tertiary if you have not done your reading. That's just like coming to this lecture without having done any reading in chapter 9 and 10. It's great, but you're not really going to know what I'm talking about. You're not really going to appreciate the benefit of what the lecture notes have to offer if you're just looking at the material for the first time. And if you are doing that, I'm not going to shame you. Maybe just pause here, go back and read chapter 9 and chapter 10, and then come back and finish the notes. See if you can compare how valuable the first half of the process was compared to how it went after you'd read the material. Try to remember that process of listening first, thinking about what their interpretation has to offer, and then writing some reflective thoughts on that material. Also, when you're prepping for a particular lecture, try to review any previous notes that the professor might have issued or that you took during the former session. Prep work before you begin taking notes can make the difference between active and passive learning. It harkens back to what we talked about in chapter 2. So that we can see some of the permutations and connections that our authors are beginning to weave during these chapters. Okay, other good notes about how to process your note taking. Try to focus on either simple paragraphs, short materials, maybe 3 to 4 sentences at a time, and leave plenty of space between those notes. You could alternatively use bulleted lists or numbered lists to help you keep information cohesive and connected. But leave space after you create those initial entries, because you may want to go back and edit your notes or clarify things, or maybe just add a thought that you found interesting after the fact. Also, I know it's kind of annoying. Not everybody has the best handwriting in the world, but try to be as neat as you can. After all, you may find somebody asking to borrow your notes. Mark your details and examples as well by indenting them. So if you have an example, don't bother to write a bullet point or write EX and then a dash or something like that. Just indent the space naturally on the page and use that. Realize that that's going to be the format for examples when you're looking for them. Now, when you're taking notes, it's also important, as it said in chapter 9, to listen actively while you're taking notes and read your text in an active way. So we looked at tips for reading actively. Let's think about tips for listening actively. Listen closely for lists, especially if an instructor says there were 3 major reasons why X, Y, and Z happened, or cause and effect dynamics. Definitions and examples, I think, are pretty straightforward, but also watch for extended commentary from your instructor. If you can tell the professor's interested in the material, that's worth revisiting or knowing closely. Now, unlike high school, if you get a professor talking and you can say, oh, it's really great to get them off on this other tangential topic, that can end up biting you in the rear, because you might find that they feel you're also interested in that material, and that may end up on a test, quiz, or exam, even though you're not generally as interested in that content as they were. Also, superlatives like most important or best explanation for this are good keys that it's worth noting. And listen to the tone and shift in his or her voice, because they can become more excited, or you can tell they're more interested, or they're adding specific emphasis if their voice fluctuates or changes. Some professors are monotone, but most, in my experience, are fairly animated, especially if they're engaged with the topic. Lastly, you may find it helpful to take down any process notes. Now, what process notes mean are those special notes regarding specifically tests, quizzes, or other project assignments. These are the kinds of things that will explain how or when to study for important information, how to think about a concept or idea, and maybe even contain rubrics like our past rubric of structuring an essay for the self-assessment project we just completed. Okay, now there are 4 tried and true methods of note-taking, which was interesting to Mr. Fowler, because when I studied this process in school, in college rather, there were only 2 methods, the Cornell method and the T-note method, but both of them are going to be illustrated here. So on the left-hand side of the screen, you can see an example of the Cornell note-taking method, which basically splits up a page to help students organize their thoughts into 3 specific sections. It asks them to create prediction questions and then create answers or notes to those questions. They then ask students to write a reflection or summary at the bottom of the page and to detail the notes at the top with objectives, topics, or at the very least, the date and class that the notes are being taken in. Again, I went all through college and I did relatively well, never used the Cornell method of note-taking. The nice thing about this method, though, is that if you like it, you don't have to actually always create your own Cornell methods. There are blank Cornell method sheets like the one that you see here that you can print out online in advance of your courses, and they may help you to maintain your organization and your notes that much more adroitly. Parallel notes. This is new, and this is a form that's really advocated by our authors Nist, Oljelnik, and Holschuch. They, again, break this down with the idea of students using a 3-ring binder. You print out a professor's notes in advance, and then you place them in the 3-ring binder so that they're followed by a blank page, so that you can look at the notes and react to them as you follow along in the lecture. Don't know if that's worthy of your time or energy. Not all instructors create notes for you to use, for example. We're getting better at that for COVID times, but again, I never use that method, and it sounds like a lot more work to me than something basic like the T-note method. Discussion columns is another new one for me. This is one that the authors advocate you use if you have a very lecture-based or discussion-based class. So if your instructor uses the Platonic method, or rather the Socratic method, Socrates is the teacher, Plato and Aristotle are the students, respectively. So for the Socratic method, you ask questions and then students answer, and then you ask them questions about their answer. So if you have a class that's more akin to that format, you might want to use some time before class to create 3 different columns or 3 spaced out columns within your notes, so that you can ask questions or write down questions that are posed by the professor. And then in a second column, you can write what your students, your fellow students, say about the questions. And then in the third column, or sort of in the middle, you can write what your professor seems to say about the other students' answers and what commentary that they would offer up. Meanwhile, for the students' side of things, you could ask yourself, what is it that your fellow students are saying or thinking about this topic, and what points did the professor expand on that they may have made? This can help you sort of harness or bring under control the free flow of ideas that a lot of discussion-based classes offer up. And again, discussion-based classes are not for everybody. They can really be boring for certain students. Like if you got caught not having read the material, or you fell behind and there's a discussion in the class that you're completely unengaged with because you didn't do the assignment, that's a difficult go for a session. This is when I think I see the most amount of students getting up, getting drinks, using the restroom, and so on and so forth. And I know that I almost never took a restroom break unless it was absolutely necessary in college, because I was interested in the discussion. I was taking notes similar to this column method. In fact, this is a method that, had I known about it or had I considered it for the time, I actually think I would have used during college. Now, here's the method I'm most familiar with and that I actually did use in college, which is the T method. This is where you simply divide your paper into 2 portions, and you focus on the key points that are discussed throughout a session using your own words so that you can inculcate the knowledge. Remember that if you just copy down what a professor says or what a professor writes, that's just drill. You don't incorporate it in your own mind. I also listed self-testing questions on the opposite side of the page. So I tried to predict things that were interesting or that I thought the professor really explained relatively well. And I would highlight or annotate those notes when I would review. Okay. Lastly, we're going to wrap things up by talking about a few myths that are related to the process of note-taking. The first one I remember seeing way back in the late 80s during an episode of Family Ties, where Alex Keaton, played by Michael J. Fox, brought a recording device to his classes. Is recording lectures a good idea? Well, not really. It's a very passive form of learning. And plus, when you go back and listen to the whole lecture, you're listening to it again. And it takes a long time. As an alternative, if you find a class to be particularly difficult and the professor speaks too quickly or in a boring monotone, try to form a study group. That way, you're only responsible for a certain portion of what the lecturer has to say, and you can bounce your ideas off of other students. And they can help to compensate for that lack of attention you may have been able to offer, or they may just have had a more interesting interpretation. Copying a classmate's notes is just as good. Well, I would say comparing notes is better than copying them. Because like I said earlier with the professor, if you take the professor's notes and study those, you're not going to get anything out of it. It's like those are their notes for their way of thinking about things. The same thing holds true with a student. You'll never really connect to that material. I guess realistically, it's better than not having notes at all for that material. But again, it's better to go back and take your own notes if possible. Again, the T method or Cornell method may be a better way to add to extant professors' notes rather than relying on those completely. And discussion-based classes make notes impossible. Well, we already talked about this enough, and I admit this is a very difficult thing to do, but the discussion method or 3-column method of note-taking may help you get a little bit more out of the process if you have to take notes in a discussion style class. So the big takeaways here, I'm going to try a little bit of inductive as opposed to deductive, as opposed to going from broad to specific. I'm going to talk about a lot of specifics, and then I'm going to try to reach a broad point here. Back in chapter 2, we spent a lot of time discussing the benefits of active learning. And we even talked about ways to make this class a little bit more active, especially given the distance that we've had to engage in due to restrictions. But note-taking and active reading are some of the most essential ways to get the most out of a particular class. I know I said most twice there, but again, not my typical way of teaching, trying to be inductive as opposed to deductive, right? So the key goal here is that if you take notes actively and think about the process as you're discovering material, you'll probably inculcate that information and move it from the forward part of your brain in your short-term memory to the back of your brain in your long-term memory. Using that old analogy again, like an elephant that strides through the pampas, right? As they stride through the pampas and make a path many times, the grass is worn down. That's like a neural connection. That means you're firing a lot more quickly. By contrast, your short-term memory, they just beat a path to get to the water, and it's still there, but it's not necessarily as easily accessed as the long-term memory or the points that you've actively learned and studied with. So again, a lot of connections back to chapter 2, a lot of good material to think about and to inculcate in your studies as you prepare for the quiz for next week. One last word about the quizzes. I noticed a lot of you have not completed quiz number 2 left. Some students did reach out to me saying that they just got the book last week. Wow. And then you were probably busy all last week writing for the essay assignment, which I think is a little bit more important. However, if you have the text now, make sure that you are completing the weekly quizzes. And if you haven't done quiz number 2 yet, do that one first. Quiz number 3 should be up and ready to go by the time that you watch this video. So that's not due until Friday. So if you want to be very keen and on point with your quizzes, try to take quiz number 3 over chapters 9 and 10 by midnight on Friday. All right, that's it for me for this week. I'm so happy that you chimed in and joined along with us. I'll post the PowerPoints on Desire to Learn, but until then, that's all I have for today. This is Mr. Fowler signing off and wishing you the best week possible. Take care.